4 years ago, I ended up taking my youngest sister and her two friends out trick-or-treating. I'm 18 now, so I was 14 when all of this happened, and my sister was only 7 back then. Tiny, full of sugar dreams, and a bit too fearless for her own good. She had 2 friends with her that night. Out of the 2, I'll just name one, Mary, to keep things private. I didn't really have any Halloween plans myself that year. No parties, no sleepovers, nothing. So when my parents told me I had to walk with them, I didn't argue. Honestly, I was even a little glad. I low-key told my sister to fill an extra bag for me at each house too. Figured if I had to be the chaperone, I might as well get paid in candy. By the time we were more than a mile away from home, the girls' plastic pumpkin buckets were already stuffed to the brim with mini chocolate bars, stale bubblegum, and off-brand lollipops. I started telling them to wrap it up and loop back toward our street before they got too tired to walk, or I did. We'd just come up to this corner house across the street from an old community park. The park had been fenced off for years, rusted swings frozen mid-sway, a broken slide that led nowhere. The house they were heading for already felt different from the rest of the neighborhood. It sat behind this old 3-foot wooden fence that boxed in the whole yard, except for the narrow walkway and the cracked driveway. The front lawn was a tangled mess of overgrown trees and thorny bushes that almost swallowed the place whole, making it look like the house itself was trying to hide. The girls scrambled up the short path, giggling and poking each other as they got to the porch. They fumbled around for the doorbell, then turned back toward me under the yellow street lamp glow and called out that there wasn't one. I shouted back for them to just knock, my breath visible in the cold October air. My sister balled her tiny fist and pounded on the door. 3 sharp bursts in separate beats that echoed just a bit too long through the tangle of trees around us. I stepped closer to the fence, about to tell them to skip it and move on, when the old front door gave a slow, aching creak. It cracked open just enough for someone's shadowed face to peek through. I could barely see them, just the pale shape of a forehead and one glinting eye catching the porch light. The girls turned back up the stoop, clutching their candy bags tight, and all 3 of them squealed out at once in bright, practiced voices. "Trick or treat!" From where I stood on the cracked sidewalk, all I could see was an arm slowly reaching out from around the edge of the door. The porch light caught on pale skin as the person lifted a single pointer finger, a silent, eerie gesture of 1 second. The way the arm pulled back into the darkness of the house, no body visible, just that lone arm vanishing, sent a cold prickling up my neck. It was like watching a puppet disappear behind a curtain, and for some reason, it made the moment feel way more unsettling than it should have. The door shut quietly, leaving the girls standing frozen on the stoop for what felt like 20 endless seconds. Their plastic bags rustled as they shifted on their feet, glancing at each other with unsure smiles. The light from the porch flickering above them like it couldn't make up its mind whether to stay on or not. I opened my mouth, ready to call out and ask what was happening, when the front door creaked open again. It was that same slow, dragging creak that sounded way too loud in the still night air, almost like the house itself was groaning. Once more, only an arm came into view, this time moving in a slow, deliberate wave, motioning the girls to come inside the house. The hand opened and closed softly, beckoning them in. I watched in disbelief as my sister and her 2 friends actually started stepping forward, walking toward the shadow inside the doorway without even glancing back at me for permission. Their feet clacked lightly against the wooden steps, and for a brief moment, the glow of the porch light caught on their costumes, making them look small, almost ghost-like in the pale light. Something twisted hard in my stomach, an instant gut punch telling me that this was wrong, that something about this house wasn't safe. I yelled out, loud and sharp, telling them to come back. My voice echoed down the empty street and over the rustling trees, and in that instant, the person at the door slammed it shut, hard, so fast it was like they were trying to cut off the moment, the sound of it rattling down the porch and making the girls jump back in shock. They hurried back over to me, clutching their bags tightly, their small faces pale and confused under the streetlights. I told them that was enough trick-or-treating for tonight, trying to keep my voice calm, but I could feel how tight my chest was as I looked back at that house. I nudged them to start walking, and we moved forward, the bags of candy thumping lightly against their legs with every step. I kept looking back, unable to shake the crawling feeling along my spine. Through the thick tangle of overgrown bushes in front of the house, I caught a glimpse of the blinds in one of the front windows rustling, shifting, like something was moving them from inside. And there, partially hidden by the slats, was the pale shape of an older man sitting by the window, watching. We kept walking home, the plastic bags of candy rustling and bumping against the girls' legs as they tried to keep up with my quicker pace. Their voices were smaller now, a little shaken, but as we moved under the glow of the streetlights, they started telling me what had actually happened at that door. They said that when the man first peeked out, he had quietly said, "1 second while I go get the candy." Then he shut the door, leaving them standing there, still and waiting. When he came back, he didn't say anything out loud. He just whispered, low enough that they had to lean in to hear, telling them to come inside to get the candy. Hearing that made something cold settle into the pit of my stomach, a heaviness that didn't leave as we walked block after block under the orange glow of the streetlights. I started thinking maybe I should call the cops right then and there, report the guy. But I also just wanted to get home, to see what my parents would say about it first, to not be the one making the wrong call. We were probably halfway down the block when something made me glance back over my shoulder. My breath caught when I saw a person just standing there at the corner, right by the block where that house was, where the overgrown bushes swallowed the porch and the rusted fence leaned toward the cracked sidewalk. They weren't moving, just standing there, a dark shape under the street lamp, watching. We made it back to our house, and I didn't even wait to take off my shoes before I told my parents everything, what the girls had said, what I had seen, and how close they had been to stepping inside that door. My parents' faces tightened, worry clouding over their initial disbelief, and they wasted no time calling my sister's friends' parents. When they got to our house, we all ended up having a long, heavy conversation in the living room, the girls sitting close together on the couch, clutching their candy bags like shields as the adults spoke in serious, hushed tones. It was decided that we would go back to the house together, but we would not go alone. We all loaded up into separate cars, the engines growling to life in the cold night air, headlights sweeping over empty yards as we pulled out of the driveway. My mom was in the passenger seat, speaking calmly but firmly with the 911 operator as we drove, updating them as we moved closer to the house. When we got there, before the police even arrived, a neighbor was already outside waiting, bundled in a jacket, their face pale in the headlights as they spoke to us through the cracked car windows. They told us that the house had been vacant for months. Nobody had been living there. Mary's dad was the first to really understand what that meant, his face darkening as the realization settled in, the gravity of it hanging heavy in the cold air between us. A sexual predator, or maybe something even worse, had been hiding inside that house on Halloween, waiting for the perfect moment to lure unsuspecting kids inside. And the part that still sends a cold shiver down my spine every time I think about it is how close it came to working. How my sister and her friends were already halfway across that threshold, ready to step inside, before I yelled for them to come back. Halloween can be a dangerous holiday, more dangerous than most people ever realize. Two years ago, I was home on Halloween. It was a Friday that year, but for me, it was a pretty normal day. While all my friends were out at parties, laughing and posting videos of themselves in costumes, I was sitting at my desk, hunched over a stack of homework. Not the most exciting way to spend Halloween night, sure, but I didn't mind too much. I really needed to get that work done anyway, and the steady scratch of my pencil and the quiet hum of the house around me kept me focused. Downstairs, my mom and dad were busy handing out candy to the few trick-or-treaters who came by. That's what they did every year, even though our street didn't get many visitors. We were pretty much the only house on the block that even bothered to hand out candy, so most kids skipped us entirely. It wasn't worth their time to walk all the way down for just one house, I guess. That night was no different. The knocks were few and far between, the sounds of small voices yelling, "Trick or treat!" drifting faintly up the stairs every now and then before the door shut again, leaving the house quiet once more. Later that night, my mom called up to me, her voice carrying through the hall in that half-whisper parents use when they're trying not to disturb the quiet too much. She asked me to come downstairs and watch the door for trick-or-treaters for a while. Apparently, our neighbors had come over asking for help with their costumes for a party, and since my parents were good with sewing and last-minute fixes, they both went upstairs to help them out. That left me alone downstairs, but it didn't bother me. I had finished my homework, the heavy weight of it off my shoulders, and I figured I could just play on my PS4 while keeping an ear out for any knocks at the door. The console hummed to life, the blue light from the screen painting the living room in a soft glow as I settled in, controller in hand. The faint rustling of candy wrappers from the bowl on the table nearby filling the otherwise quiet room. Only a couple more trick-or-treaters showed up over the next hour, tiny ghosts and superheroes knocking timidly before grabbing a handful of candy and running back down the dark street. It was pretty typical for this area, quiet, almost too quiet for Halloween. Then, around 11 p.m., just when the game I was playing had me completely zoned in, I heard a knock at the front door. It was sharp, clear, echoing through the quiet of the living room, making me pause with the controller still in my hands, the game's music continuing softly in the background as I turned to look at the door. I thought it was pretty weird, hearing a knock that late. It had been almost an hour since the last trick-or-treater, and by now, most kids were either home counting their loot or already passed out from too much candy. It was getting late even for the die-hard trick-or-treaters who like to squeeze out every last piece of candy before calling it a night. Still, I grabbed the bowl of candy and made my way toward the front door. It's important to mention that there's a small entryway between the front door and the living room at our house, a narrow space where shoes get kicked off and packages get dropped. Whenever we answer the front door, we always lock the inner door that leads back into the living room, just to keep our dogs from running up and barking their heads off at whoever's outside. I did the same thing this time, pulling the inner door shut and clicking the lock into place before I turned to open the front door. When I did, I froze for a second. Standing there in the glow of the porch light was a surprisingly large man. He had to be at least 6'3", with broad shoulders and a frame that made the narrow doorway feel even smaller. He was wearing a Michael Myers costume, and it wasn't one of those cheap plastic outfits you find last minute at a party store. This one looked real, expensive even. The mask was stark white, the hair matted down like it had been rained on, the dark coveralls fitting tightly across his chest and arms. He just stood there, towering over me, and didn't say a single word. It felt wrong immediately. You're supposed to say trick or treat, even if you're an older kid or trying to be spooky for fun. But he didn't move, didn't tilt his head, didn't even reach for the candy bowl in my hand. He just stared at me through the black eye holes of that mask, the shadows swallowing whatever lay behind them, making it impossible to tell if he was even blinking. For a moment, it was like he wasn't a person at all, just a statue planted there on the doorstep, silent and heavy, letting the cold air creep in around him as he stood unmoving. And it was working. The intimidation, the eerie silence, the way the mask caught the porch light and made his presence feel larger than life. It was creeping me out more than I wanted to admit. I'm not exactly small for a guy, but I'm not huge either. About 5'10", and next to him, I felt like a kid again, looking up at something that wasn't supposed to be there. Trying to break the suffocating silence, I decided to speak first, forcing out a shaky laugh as I shifted the candy bowl in my hands. "Trick or treat," I said for him, the words feeling strange in the heavy silence as I held out the bowl and dropped a few pieces of candy into his open hand. I couldn't believe what he did next. Instead of taking the candy, saying thank you, and turning to leave like every other trick-or-treater, he took a few slow, deliberate steps into my house. Right then, something in the air changed, thickening, pressing against my chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe. Every instinct I had screamed that this wasn't right. There's an unspoken rule, one everyone knows, even kids know it. You don't walk into someone's house on Halloween without being invited. But there he was, stepping across the threshold, his heavy boots thudding softly against the floor of the entryway, the mask on his face never shifting, never acknowledging the fear that must have been written all over mine. And that's when I noticed something else. He didn't have a bag for candy. No pillowcase, no plastic pumpkin bucket, nothing. That was the moment the cold realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't there to trick or treat. Before I could move, before I could even think about slamming the door shut, the man reached into his pocket and pulled something out. I didn't want to look, didn't want to know what it was, but my eyes flickered down anyway, catching the glint of something dark, something metal in the dim light of the hallway. I didn't know exactly what it was, but my mind screamed that it was a weapon, and every cell in my body went cold. I was trapped. I had locked myself in a small entryway with a man much larger than me, a man in a Michael Myers costume holding a weapon, standing between me and the only way out. We all like to think we'd know what to do in a situation like this. We play out little hero fantasies in our heads, how we'd fight back, how we'd find a way to save the day, how we'd be the one who made it out alive because we were brave enough, smart enough. But when it actually happens, when it's real, it's different. I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my breath stuck in my throat. I couldn't even lift my arms. It was like I wasn't even in control of my own body, like I was watching myself from far away, caught in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Frozen in fear, the sound of my own heartbeat was pounding in my ears, louder than the quiet that stretched between us, louder than the faint rustle of the costume fabric as he shifted his weight. And as ridiculous as it sounds, as absurd and horrifying as it felt, the thought that crossed my mind, clear as day, was what a cliché way to die this would be. Stabbed to death by someone dressed as Michael Myers on Halloween. Thankfully, it didn't go the way I thought it would. Because without any warning, the guy suddenly ripped off his mask, revealing a flushed, sweaty face underneath, and with a crooked grin, he said, "I'm just messing with you, bro." I was still frozen, my body stuck in that thick, heavy fear, unable to process what had just happened. I couldn't even get a single word out, my mouth hanging open, the bowl of candy trembling slightly in my hands. He laughed, a sharp, uneven sound that echoed weirdly in the narrow entryway, and leaned in a little closer. "I scared you though, right?" he said, almost proud of himself, like it was some badge of honor. Completely confused and still terrified, I somehow managed to force out a shaky, "Yeah, you got me." He chuckled again, like this was all just a hilarious joke, and slipped the knife back into his pocket. The moment I saw the blade disappear, a wave of relief washed over me, leaving my legs weak, but the tension didn't fully leave the air, not with him still standing there, so close, still blocking the only way out. He looked at the bowl in my hands, eyes flickering down, and said, "I didn't really come here to trick or treat, but can I have that candy anyway? I'm really hungry." I didn't hesitate. I practically shoved the bowl toward him, letting him grab as much as he wanted. Anything to get him to leave, anything to keep him happy, because even though he had put the knife away, it was still there, still within reach, and I didn't want to give him any reason to pull it out again. He started rambling then, talking about how he had just left his friend's Halloween party and saw the lights on in my house and decided it would be funny to prank someone by pretending to be Michael Myers. Up close, it was obvious he was drunk. The way he swayed slightly, the way his eyes were glassy and unfocused, the faint smell of alcohol mixing with something sharper, weed probably. He thought this was a good prank, that showing up at a stranger's house dressed as Michael Myers with a knife was somehow funny. He mentioned how he owned a tattoo place about an hour away from here, slurring a little as he said it, and then looked me up and down before nodding like he'd just decided something. "You're pretty chill," he said, like we were old friends, like this whole thing hadn't just happened. "We should hang out sometime." Then he pulled out his phone, fumbling with it, and told me to put his name and number in my phone so we could chill soon. The last thing I wanted to do was argue. The last thing I wanted to do was upset him while he was still standing there, still blocking the only exit, still carrying that knife in his pocket. So I made sure to take down his name and number, forcing my hands to stop shaking long enough to type it in, nodding and forcing a small, tight smile while I did it, praying that it would be enough to get him to leave. I basically agreed to everything he said, nodding along, forcing out small laughs, anything to keep him calm while my heart pounded so hard it felt like it was rattling my rib cage. I was still terrified. Every second felt like it stretched on forever, like we were stuck in some endless, suffocating conversation that I couldn't escape no matter how many polite nods I gave or how many fake smiles I forced. and despite his sloppy grin and slurred attempts at jokes, I didn't feel safe. Not for a second. There was something way off about him. Something in the way his eyes darted around the room, the way he leaned in too close when he talked, the way his hand kept brushing against the pocket where he had put the knife. I got this feeling deep in my gut, that heavy, crawling instinct that told me he was dangerous, that I needed to get him out of my house before something went wrong. So I decided to lie. I cleared my throat, tried to sound casual, and said, "Hey man, I actually have something in the oven I need to check on, but I'll text you later, okay?" For a moment, I wasn't sure if he would buy it. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes squinting as if he was trying to decide whether I was telling the truth. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "Okay," turned around and stepped back outside. The second his foot crossed the threshold, I slammed the door shut, the loud click of the lock echoing through the entryway as I turned it. I even double-checked it, pressing my hand against the door, making sure it was secure before I backed away, the breath I'd been holding finally coming out in a shaky rush. My heart was still pounding, so hard and so fast that it felt like it was going to burst right out of my chest. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to press them against my thighs just to steady them. That was, without a doubt, the most terrifying and strangest experience of my entire life. And yet, I decided not to call the police. The guy hadn't actually done anything, hadn't hurt me, hadn't tried to break in. I told myself he didn't have any real malicious intent, that he was just out of his mind, drunk, high, and clueless about how terrifying he was. Creepy, dangerous, but not a psychopath, I told myself. I still have his number in my phone to this day, sitting there in my contacts under the name he made me save. But we've never texted, never called each other, and that's exactly the way I want it to stay. As terrifying as that night was, I can look back now and laugh, using it as one of those "you won't believe what happened to me" stories to share with friends, a strange badge of honor for surviving one of the weirdest Halloweens of my life. But it taught me something important. Be careful who you open your door for on Halloween. There are some really weird and messed up people out there, and I got lucky. Lucky that he wasn't a complete psychopath, because in that moment, in that narrow entryway with the door locked behind me and him standing between me and freedom, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, stopping him from pulling that knife out again and stabbing me. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. The costumes, the late-night air buzzing with excitement, the thrill of walking through dark streets with a pillowcase growing heavier with candy. There was nothing else like it. But ever since one not-so-sweet round of trick-or-treating, I've kind of switched over to liking Christmas the most. It was 2006, and I was 14 years old. That year, I was out trick-or-treating with Johnny, who was my best friend at the time. I still remember that night clearly. It was a Tuesday, so everyone had school the next day, which meant the usual chaos you'd see on Halloween. Teenagers running around with toilet paper and shaving cream, yelling and causing a scene, wasn't really happening that year. Everything felt a little quieter, a little more controlled, which I guess I thought was a good thing at the time. My parents wanted me back by 11 at the latest, and Johnny's parents had told him the same. We kept that in the back of our minds as we moved from house to house, But it was still only around 8:30, and I remember checking my wristwatch over and over, the faint glow of it lighting up my sleeve in the darkness. We were down on a bunch of blocks by the east end of town, close to the woods and the highway, where the houses were spaced farther apart and the streetlights were fewer, leaving long stretches of shadow between the pools of yellow light. We both knew this would probably be our last year going trick-or-treating. Next year we'd be too old for it, and we'd have to find other ways to spend Halloween night. So we were determined to get as much candy as possible, to squeeze every last bit of fun out of the night before it was gone for good. We went door to door, ringing doorbell after doorbell, saying "trick or treat" in voices that were a little too deep to sound like kids anymore, laughing quietly as we shoved more candy into our bags. As the night wore on, I noticed the number of kids out on the sidewalks started to thin out. The voices and laughter that had filled the streets were slowly fading, leaving behind only the sound of our footsteps on the damp pavement. At the same time, fewer people were answering their doors, and the glow of porch lights flickered off one by one as families decided to call it a night. Then it started to drizzle. The rain was cold, the kind that feels like pinpricks on your skin, and the wet leaves on the sidewalk stuck to our shoes as we walked. That's when the streets really emptied out, turning into a ghost town. The air so quiet that we could hear the rain tapping on the hoods of our jackets and the distant hiss of tires on wet roads. But that didn't stop us. We were determined to keep going, determined to fill our bags until they were too heavy to carry, determined to hang on to Halloween for just one more year, even as the dark streets and the drizzle pressed in around us. We were now about 3 houses down from the place everyone in town called Hell House. It had earned that nickname because of an alleged murder that had happened inside decades ago, or so the stories went. The house itself looked the part too, like it was built over 100 years ago and had somehow gotten stuck in time while the rest of the neighborhood moved on, leaving it to loom over the street like a dark reminder of the past. There was even a whole web page about it back then, filled with lore and creepy stories about what had supposedly happened there. I don't really remember all the details anymore, and the website is long gone now, but back then, everyone loved to talk about it in hushed tones, daring each other to go near it on Halloween. Nobody really seemed to know if anyone lived there or not. Maybe the neighbors knew, but we didn't live close enough to ever hear the real story, and honestly, we didn't care enough to find out. It was the mystery of it that made it exciting. And that night, with our bags of candy already half full, and the drizzle turning the streetlights into blurry halos, me and Johnny were feeling brave. Cocky, even. So we decided to hop the creepy old fence that surrounded the property, the wood damp and splintering under our hands as we climbed over, our feet landing with a soft thud on the overgrown grass on the other side. We made our way up to the stoop, which was made of ancient, worn-out red bricks that felt like they might crumble under our weight. The air smelled like wet earth and old leaves, and the sound of the rain tapping on the wooden awning above us was steady, almost comforting in the silence around the house. There was no doorbell, so we knocked a few times, the sound dull and heavy against the weather-warped wood of the front door. We waited, glancing at each other, pretending we weren't expecting anything to happen. The drizzle started turning into a steady rain, the cold drops blowing in sideways and splattering against our jackets. But under the awning, we were dry, and for a moment, it felt easier to just stand there than to walk back into the rain. Johnny, trying to break the tension, laughed and knocked on the door again, louder this time, making a joke about the ghosts inside probably being too old to hear him. But my focus was already shifting, my mind wandering to the long, wet walk home we still had ahead of us, wondering how bad the rain would get and how soaked we'd be by the time we got back. Then, out of nowhere, a loud thud echoed from inside the house. It was sharp, sudden, and heavy enough that it made the floor under our feet seem to vibrate for a split second, and both of us jumped, the sound of the rain and the cold air around us suddenly feeling like it was closing in tighter as we froze, wide-eyed, staring at the door. Johnny whispered that it sounded like it came from a window upstairs. I didn't even try to hide the fear in my voice when I replied, "Let's leave." Without another word, we turned and started walking quickly back down the red brick pathway, our shoes splashing in small puddles that had formed in the cracks between the bricks, the rain steadily pattering against our jackets and hair. We didn't dare look back as we reached the black, graveyard-like gate, climbing over it with shaking hands, landing hard on the wet sidewalk. Finally, we stopped, our breaths coming out in sharp clouds in the cold air, and turned to look back at the house, the dark silhouette of it almost blending into the stormy sky above. The rain fell in thin, cold sheets, streaking down our faces, dripping from our chins as we stood there trying to catch our breath. Johnny bumped me on the shoulder, harder than necessary, making me flinch before I realized he was pointing at something. My eyes followed his hand to the upper middle window of the house, and the moment I saw it, it felt like my heart dropped out of my chest. Someone was standing there, clear as day, staring down at us through the rain-smeared, foggy glass. There was something horribly wrong about their face, though I couldn't tell exactly what it was through the distortion of the rain and the grime on the window. It was just the way the face seemed too pale, the features somehow both blurry and sharp at the same time. The way the eyes seemed too dark, too empty, locked onto us, like they were seeing straight through the night, through the rain, and right into us. It was the kind of moment that felt like something straight out of a horror movie. The scene you watch with your hands half covering your eyes, telling yourself it's not real. But this was real. And before we could even process what we were seeing, the person in the window snapped their head to the side, quick and aggressive, and then seemed to run away from the window, disappearing into the darkness of the house. Both of us jumped again, the shock shooting straight down to our feet, and there was no time to think about what came next. All we could assume was that whoever it was, they were coming outside after us. We bolted, our shoes slapping against the wet pavement, until we reached the neighbor's wooden fence that faced the backyard of Hell House. We crouched down low, trying to disappear into the shadows, the sound of the rain thankfully masking the sharp gasps of our breathing and the frantic whispers between us. The fence was old, with warped wooden slats and plenty of gaps that allowed us to peek through to the yard next door, our eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the entire fence around us started to shake, the wood vibrating under our fingertips as we pressed ourselves against it, trying to stay hidden. But when we peered through the holes, there was nothing on the other side. No footsteps, no shadowy figure, nothing moving in the yard, even as the fence continued to rattle softly in the rain. And we were certain it wasn't us who had made it move. Johnny and I didn't even need to speak to each other to know it was time to get out of there. We both just agreed with a look, breathing hard in the cold rain, and decided it was time to make a run for it back to my house. We stood up, the wet grass and mud sticking to our knees, and as we turned to run, I caught sight of something at the edge of the fence, just at the corner where the boards met. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. The darkness, the rain, and the shadows from the streetlights made everything blur together. But then it hit me hard, like ice water down my spine. It was a person. They were leaning over the fence, bending at the waist so that their upper body was hanging over to our side, the soaked fabric of their clothes clinging to their torso. One arm was reaching around the fence, fingers curled loosely, as if they were about to grasp the wood or reach for us. The way they were positioned, the way they were just staring at us, not moving, not blinking, just watching, was so horrifying that the image burned itself into my memory. The rain dripping off their hair, their face pale and empty under the thin light. That was it for us. We dropped our candy bags, the plastic thudding softly against the wet ground, candy spilling out and scattering into puddles, and we ran. We tore down the block, feet pounding the slick pavement, our breaths ragged in the cold air, the rain lashing against our faces as we pushed ourselves to move faster, not daring to look back. I tripped twice, landing hard, scraping my hands and knees on the asphalt, but I scrambled up both times, ignoring the sting of cuts and the ache in my legs, too afraid to slow down for even a second. After 5 blocks of pure, breathless panic, we finally reached my house, soaked to the bone, mud streaked across our jeans, our hearts still hammering in our chests. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. We both knew that what we did could probably get us in trouble, and neither of us wanted to try to explain to our parents why we had been at Hell House in the first place, let alone why we had left our candy behind. But the really scary part came the next day. After school, we went back to that street and decided to ask some of the neighbors about the house, hoping to get some explanation. Anything that would make what we saw make sense. But every neighbor we talked to gave us the same response. They had no idea who, if anyone, lived there. They said they had never seen a car in the driveway, never saw anyone outside, never saw lights on inside. It was just there. One neighbor mentioned that a for sale sign had appeared in the yard a few months earlier, but had disappeared just as suddenly a few days later, and no one seemed to know why. We ended up telling the neighbors what we had seen, our voices shaking as we described the figure in the window, the noise, the person leaning over the fence. The looks on their faces said it all. They were disturbed deeply by what we told them, and it was clear they had no explanations to give us. I moved out of that neighborhood the next year, in 2007, and since then I've never had to worry about that house, or who or what might have been living inside of it. All I know is that something strange was going on in there, something we were never meant to see. And part of me still wishes I found out what.